Yo, it's the Latino Newsletter podcast. That's right, a show about us all the time. I am your host, Julio Ricardo Varela. And a special thanks to the generous support from the Latino Community Foundation for season 1 of this podcast. Learn more about the Latino Community Foundation at latinocf.org. Alrighty, kids, this is episode 9. 9 weeks of shows. We're starting to get to double digits. I'm so excited. And the response has been great. Thank you so much for all your support. All right. Over the last week, Puerto Rico has been on my mind a lot because Friday, September 20th, marked the 7th anniversary of Hurricane María devastating the island. And if people remember those times, you know, the week right after was kind of when the reality started showing up of the devastation. So I never think about the anniversary as like just September 20th. I think about the anniversary as, you know, September 20th till like middle of October of 2017 because of the situations that were happening, all the things that were happening. And it just brought back so much. And there is a lot out there about a post-Hurricane Maria world and what it all means. And there are a lot of local key issues that are happening on the island colony right now. We're doing the best that we can to cover it at the Latino Newsletter. Great piece by Carlos Berrios Polanco about the voter registration issues. And we're going to continue to shine a light on that, both at the Latino Newsletter and also on my own social media profiles and the work that I do. But I will say this, though, if you see this as a good or bad thing, we can have that discussion. But the last week of the 2024 election added Puerto Rico and the post-Hurricane Maria world into the campaign. For example, and I'm talking about specifically what happened just this past weekend in Pennsylvania when Liza Colón-Zayas, who had just won an Emmy for The Bear to become the first Latina to win the Best Supporting Actress in a Comedy Series in the history of the Emmys. A week later, after she won the Emmy, she gets on stage in Pennsylvania at a Tim Walz campaign rally and said this about Puerto Rico.
That's right, because we remember after Hurricane Maria devastated the island, Trump blocked billions of dollars in hurricane relief. Okay, contributing to thousands of deaths. How he disrespected us and how he called Puerto Rico dirty and poor and tossed paper towels at us. We can't go back. Okay, the Biden-Harris administration has begun investing $140 billion toward Puerto Rico's economy, environment, recovery, and infrastructure.
So that happened in Pennsylvania last weekend. I'm really fascinated by political talking points about Puerto Rico and will it have an impact with the diaspora. In the meantime, I'm completely aware of what's going on in Puerto Rico this week. From the billboards by Bad Bunny against the pro-statehood party and how they're reacting to that. I also tweeted, I said, is this the election of Bad Bunny, right? And then the Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, the Center for Investigative Journalism, on Monday dropped this blockbuster investigation about alleged voter fraud and hundreds and thousands of dead people on the voter rolls, and how that impacts voting and the two colonial parties, the pro-statehood party, the Populares, all that, right? And the repercussions of that, there was a letter sent to the Department of Justice from Nydia Velázquez and, you know, a handful of House Democrats asking for the Department of Justice to go observe what's going on in Puerto Rico. Like, that's where we are. And then we're also covering the voter registration mess. So I understand all that. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're actually talking about Democratic talking points with the Puerto Rican diaspora in the 2024 election cycle. How niche is that? And I have a really good guest to join me on this. So let me read her bio. Tanzina Vega is a contributing writer for the Boston Globe opinion section and founder of La Mala Media, which provides strategy, writing, and podcast services for companies and brands. Previously, Tanzina was a reporter and producer for the New York Times and CNN, where she led coverage of race and inequality and was the first Latina host of The Takeaway on WNYC, New York Public Radio, and the first Puerto Rican woman to host a national radio program on public radio. Tanzina's also been a recipient of the Robert G. Magruder Distinguished Lecture and Award from Kent State University for her coverage of race, and she also won a Contributing Producer Emmy Award in News and Documentary. She has had fellowships at the Nation Institute and at Princeton University, where she served as a Ferris Professor of Journalism. Tanzina Vega, welcome to the Latino Newsletter podcast.
Thank you so much, Julio. I'm thrilled to be here.
Tanzina, we just played the Liza Colon Zayas speech, parts of it, at the Tim Walz rally last weekend in Pennsylvania. Can you just give me your initial reactions to what Liza said on that podium? Because I don't ever recall a Puerto Rican woman on a main presidential campaign podium talking about Puerto Rico like that.
Well, I mean, I want to give political credit where credit is due. AOC came up in my class last night. I teach a graduate journalism class at NYU, and one of my students is not from New York and totally fascinated by all the things that she's done as a Puerto Rican woman in Congress. And so, we have had some representation, but I think like you're talking about Liza Colosayas, and she, first of all, fascinated by her in The Bear. So her actual work as a Latina actress who looks and feel like people from my community, born and raised in New York, and just, all different shades and colors and political perspectives of Boricuas. And it's amazing to see her personally on doing this kind of work. But the other thing that's important, and I noticed that she mentioned this while she was accepting her Emmy, which was for people to go out and vote. And I think, we've talked about this, Latinos have been talking about this. There's still people calling us the sleeping giant. And I think it's wonderful that she's on the campaign trail because people need to see that in action. Puerto Ricans in the mainland and on the island do have a history of spotty voting, right? We're not always a reliable voting bloc. And so, I learned that when I went down to Orlando. Remember, there was a little election in 2016 where people were, Hillary Clinton was involved. And this was before Donald Trump became the nominee. And there were lots of people in Orlando, which is as you know, a hotbed for, a hotspot for Puerto Rican community, who were unsure about what they wanted to do about the vote then. And I think, we're in a post-Hurricane Maria world. Lots of Puerto Ricans were very involved and very active, immediately following Hurricane Maria. But I think we need that jolt. I think we need that additional, I think what she's doing is important because we need people to remind us of the consequences of Hurricane Maria and also just the larger Puerto Rican diaspora and the issues that we're facing. So I think it's really important that she be out there.
This is why I wanted to have you on, because it is about this sort of how Hurricane Maria 7 years later has now become this democratic strategy to reach Puerto Rican diaspora voters, particularly in a place like Pennsylvania, because it seems to be a diasporic issue just in the context of Hurricane Maria and what's happened. Will it get people to vote? Give me your thoughts on all that.
I mean, I think what we need to do, and I hate to say this, when I was hosting the takeaway in the first year after Hurricane Maria, I made the editorial call to go to the island and talk to folks who were there and talk about, where they were at that time, 1 year post Maria. And the conversation was very decidedly about resilience. People were, had been through hell. They'd lost houses, they'd lost loved ones. We visited a funeral director who talked about, what they had to deal with. I mean, it was a heavy, heavy, heavy moment to be there. And it was also one filled with a lot of promise, right? Filled with a lot of people who really wanted to see Puerto Rico do better and get better. And at that moment, and I'm sure you agree, that there was also a diasporic sort of, connection. Oftentimes the sort of, I don't want to call us mainland Puerto Ricans, but those of us who live in the continental US, are often, not always politically on the same page as folks who live on the island for a variety of reasons. So I think there was a moment of solidarity post Maria that I think has since been overshadowed. And so I want to talk about two issues here. One, which is the fact that Hurricane Maria, the vestiges of Maria are still there. People, the poorest Puerto Ricans are still struggling. It's not an easy place to be or live, to be honest. And yet at the same time, politicizing an event like a natural disaster like Hurricane Maria, like you said, it can be a slippery slope. We want people to remember what happened. We want people to remember their political power. I mean, Puerto Ricans on the island ousted their own governor. That's how much political power they had. How does that political power translate here in the United States? Following that, have we had some sort of cultural amnesia about what happened with Maria? Because I'm seeing a lot of like remembrances and it's 7 years later, but I'm not seeing a lot of solidarity and organizing, from a political standpoint, which is why I think what Liza's doing is really important. On the flip side, I just want to say the island itself has experienced extraordinary gentrification. And so that is something that I have my eye on as well, as far as what that means for Puerto Ricans, on the island.
You're absolutely right. There was this moment of solidarity. It was one of those moments of, wow, everyone's together. But now there seems to be like a division, right? When the sense that the Democratic talking points of a post-Hurricane Maria world are very, I don't know, predictable. And that's the bigger question, because there seems to be a tension between what's happening locally in Puerto Rico and what's happening nationally in getting Puerto Rican swing voters in Pennsylvania. Could those two environments coexist, or do you know what I mean? Like, because that to me is what I've seen over the last week when it comes to Hurricane Maria, because I do agree with you. Vice President Harris released a statement Friday night about the 7th anniversary of Hurricane Maria, but at like 9:30 at night.
Yeah, see, I didn't even see that. Yeah.
Do you know what I'm trying to get here? It's this notion of, Puerto Ricans in the United States have the vote. They can move elections. They could actually maybe put Puerto Rico on the map, but their talking points seem a little bit stale and sort of out of touch with what you just said, what's happening in Puerto Rico during their election season, with the power outages, with the debt, with the gentrification, with the corruption, with the new, left-center alliance and the voter registration issues that we've been covering. Break it down for me.
I mean, here's the truth. You said that the Harris campaign issued a statement about the 7th anniversary of Puerto Rico at 9:30 p.m. on a Friday. I didn't know they had issued anything at all, to be honest. So at least they did something. But I think that, we are not, when I was hosting the Takeaway a few years ago, I made an editorial decision to cover the islands as part of our overall national coverage, right?
Yeah.
I ran a national show, and Puerto Rico, like it or not, feel however you want to feel about it, is part of the United States. It's a colony of the United States. There are many ways that we can look at this, but when we have national conversations, we can't have them without Puerto Rico at the table. And unfortunately, what has happened is that I haven't seen that conversation. Now, granted, there have been a bunch of other things going on. So we've had a pandemic, we've had an insurrection, we've had, global, wars happening. So I understand that the news cycle, has evolved. But I also think that, unfortunately, there isn't a lot of coverage coming out about what's happening on the island. Your quote unquote mainstream media has totally ignored Puerto Rico. And there's unfortunately there's a gap there. And so I think we're back to seeing, the most I'm hearing about Puerto Rico is that J-Lo and Ben Affleck are not married anymore. Like, I think we need to we need outlets that will continue to focus on the issues affecting Puerto Ricans on the mainland or in the continental US and Puerto Ricans on the island, because we're not getting all the information. And I think once again, unfortunately, we've sort of been relegated to a side note in a lot of national coverage. And, Puerto Rico is still facing on the island. You mentioned the Luma electric outages. Like my parents were recently in Puerto Rico, and my mother was like, every couple of hours the lights go out. That was even in rural Puerto Rico. It didn't used to be that way. And so when I would, go to the island as a kid, I didn't remember that se la fue la luz, every 5 minutes. So
exactly.
This is something that is really interesting. And I think that media has really taken their eye off of this. What I do hear a lot about is, you mentioned Puerto Ricans have a vote, but we don't have a voice in Congress, right? So we have this representative in Congress who is very much aligned with and supports Donald Trump. And so that
Jennifer
is also,
Gonzalez.
We don't talk a lot about the fact that not all Puerto Ricans in the continental U.S. or on the island are necessarily going to vote Democrat. We have folks who are not going to vote at all, who are independent, who are Republican. So it's not a sure bet to get this vote. And I agree with you. I think it could move. But even look at New York City, right? Look at Chicago. Like, where's the representation in local government of Puerto Ricans? That's another thing I'm really, in the areas and in the cities where we have huge populations, Massachusetts, right? Where you're in. I'm not sure that that's even translating to local politics, as far as our voices and our issues.
Wow, you dropped a lot of knowledge, and this is
Sorry.
why no. It's good. It's good. You're just teeing it up for me, Tanzina. The big philosophical question I have, because there is this talk about, los puertorriqueños, boricua, unidos, somos 9 millones y todo, blah, blah, blah. We're 9 million, and we're going to make a difference in Pennsylvania and Florida and all these states. Do Puerto Ricans in the diaspora have political power? Do you think we're starting to see the beginnings of that? Because you do talk about lack of local representation, but then you have, AOC and Nidia Velázquez, Dan and Soto. You have a couple of other Puerto Rican elected officials that are showing up places like St. Louis and Minnesota. What's the state of political power in the Puerto Rican diaspora, in your opinion?
I wish I knew. I mean, I wish I could see things. AOC wasn't necessarily voted in by Puerto Ricans, right? She was voted in by New Yorkers and Queens residents. And so I think that we have political power. We just don't use it. And I think that there's a sort of I hate to say this, maybe a colonial sort of hangover that a lot of, our folks in our community have, where we're striving to be part of, like you mentioned, 9 million of us in the diaspora. Nobody's called me. I was the only Puerto Rican woman who was on public radio hosting a nationally syndicated show. So I think that we have clusters of Puerto Ricans who are trying to do interesting things, but it's very siloed.
Yeah.
I don't see a lot of sort of community engagement. I'm not hearing a lot about what's happening on the island, with the exception of a few of these, big stories that are just unrecognized. You can't not talk about, a power outage that lasts days and days. But maybe I'm a little pessimistic, but I just don't see. I hope that Puerto Ricans make it out to the polls. I hope that Puerto Ricans make a decision, both on what they want for those living on the island and how we can see more, because really what we're talking about when we're talking about Puerto Ricans is also, poverty. We're talking about class distinctions. We're talking about racial distinctions, right? And so those are issues that, when it comes to income inequality, when it comes to education, when it comes to racism, we are susceptible to all of those things. And I'm just not seeing Latinos more broadly, I should say, really engaging in these conversations on main stages. You mentioned Liza. I think that's great. I think we need to see more Latinos. I think the conversation about politics is heavily bifurcated right now. And the Latino question, once again, is sort of, getting lost in the sauce, if you will.
Lost in the sauce. And the 9 millones, the 9 million is a combination, right? People on the island and people on the diaspora. Right. And so as a Puerto Rican journalist, you identify as Puerto Rican, you don't just cover Puerto Rico. Any final thoughts about sort of the politics of Hurricane Maria in the 2024 election? Have we become sort of the Democratic political trope because Trump, what Liza says, people tend to forget. I'm so tired of the paper towels, but the selling of Puerto Rico and all this and what happened, people tend to forget how the response, even the days before Hurricane Maria, you see some of the words that Trump said a couple of days before and then the first couple of weeks. There's a lot there to unpack, and I think we've forgotten a little bit. We have short memories as American news consumers. Any final thoughts about that in the context of all this?
When Hurricane Maria happened, I was sitting in Princeton University, and I was a visiting lecturer for that semester.
Right.
And I was also at CNN, and I called up my editor, and I said, I have to write about this. I have to write about this from the perspective of a woman who grew up was born in New York City. So I'm a New Yorican by many, many cultural definers, but spent every summer going to the island like many Puerto Ricans in the diaspora. And once I started seeing journalists going into, communities like the ones that I would visit, the ones that my grandparents were from, places like Utuado, where there was never a tourist. You know what I mean? Like these are, neighborhoods and towns that are deep in the mountains. And once I started seeing that, I felt a real protection of my island. I felt like there were people who were going there who perhaps would have seen Puerto Ricans and never given a second thought, but suddenly we were front and center, and there were journalists all over these small towns that they'd never cared about, frankly. And I felt really protective of that. I felt like, are we going to be used? Are we going to, be cared for? And, I hate to say it, I think we're still very much a colony. We're still dealing with this colonial relationship with the United States.
Yeah.
We have some success stories, and that's great, but I think we need to do more. And I'm particularly concerned, not just about what the Puerto Rican vote will be for 2024, but I'm really concerned about what is happening to the island itself, with the gentrification of the island, with the buying up of properties, with, I even know a lot of Puerto Ricans who are like wanting to get a piece of it, and like they have enough money, they're going down there and they're trying to buy everybody's trying to buy a piece of this island.
Right.
And I'm really upset at how I'm seeing the landscape of Puerto Rico being ripped apart, beaches being privatized, people who really who aren't getting the services they need, continue to not getting the services they need. And so that's my concern. I'm really concerned about the economics that are happening and are playing out on the island. And I think that we as Puerto Ricans have to do a lot more, frankly, to be in solidarity with each other, to be able to move things forward, because it's not going to work if we're all sort of siloed and everybody's trying to get their own piece of the pie.
Wow, that's a summary. Tanzina Vega, thank you so much for being on the Latino Newsletter podcast. We'd love to have you back.
I think what you're doing is great, Julio. I commend you. You've always been a visionary, and you've always been someone who's willing to take chances. And so, we're in a media environment right now that's exactly what we need. So keep going, and I'm happy to come back.
You keep going too, my friend. Thanks again. There you go. Tanzina Vega, keeping it real as always. The Latino Newsletter is produced and edited by me, Julio Ricardo Varela, and fellow Boricua Joaquin Cotler. Mixing and sound design by Joaquin Cotler. Music by Cast of Characters via Soundstripe. You can now donate to us at thelatinonewsletter.org and click on the donate tab, or you can donate directly on Spotify. Please subscribe. Give us $3. Give us 10 cents. We'll take it. And if you like what you heard, share this podcast and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Like we said, we're on Spotify, but you can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Audible, iHeartRadio. We also have the podcast on YouTube. I need to plug YouTube. On Twitter, we are at Lat Newsletter, and you can follow us on other social platforms at The Latino Newsletter. And if you really, really want to get in touch with me, you can send me an email to julio@thelatinonewsletter.org. All right, we'll be back next week with show number 10, double digits. We'll have a lot of fun with this. Peace out, y'all.